The candle went out before anyone heard the scream. Years later, those who had served at Ashcombe Hall would remember that single detail more clearly than anything else. Time blurred faces, softened voices, and carried away the sharp edges of grief, yet no amount of passing seasons could erase the memory of that tiny flame disappearing beneath the study door. One moment warm light spilled into the corridor. The next, the hallway was swallowed by darkness, followed by a sound so strange that every servant remembered it differently. Some insisted it had been a woman's cry. Others believed someone had shouted a name. A few claimed there had been no scream at all, only the heavy silence that follows when something irreversible has happened. What none of them disputed was what came afterward. By the time the footman reached the foot of the east staircase with a lamp in trembling hands, the Countess of Ashcombe lay motionless upon the polished oak floor. One delicate hand still clutched a single white glove, as though she had refused to let it go even in her final moment. Her dark hair spread across the steps like spilled silk, and standing only a few feet away was her husband, Julian Ashcombe, the 3rd Earl of Ashcombe. No one ever forgot the look on his face. It was not anger. It was not panic. It was the expression of a man whose world had shattered so completely that he could no longer understand what he was seeing. The doctor arrived before midnight. The coroner came the following morning. 3 days later, the official verdict was delivered with all the certainty that official papers often carried. A tragic accident. The Countess had slipped on a loose stair rod while descending in poor light. Her injuries were consistent with a fall. The matter was considered deeply unfortunate, but entirely straightforward. The newspapers accepted it without question. The magistrate closed the case. Neighbors sent flowers. Life, at least for everyone beyond the gates of Ashcombe Hall, quietly continued. Inside the house, however, nothing ever felt ordinary again. Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper who had devoted more than 20 years to serving the Ashcombe family, never believed the explanation. She had climbed those same stairs countless times carrying trays, linens, ledgers, and candles. She knew every creak of the old house as well as she knew the lines on her own hands. Something about that night refused to settle in her mind. She could not prove it. She could not even explain it. But whenever she stood at the foot of the staircase, she felt the same cold certainty settle over her shoulders. The Countess had not simply fallen. Yet suspicion without evidence was a dangerous thing, especially in a house already drowning in grief. So Mrs. Prewitt did what every servant eventually learned to do. She remained silent. The Earl remained silent as well. He ordered his wife's study locked. He instructed the staff never to disturb it. The portrait that had once hung proudly in the East Gallery was turned toward the wall. No one questioned the order. No one dared speak Caroline Ashcombe's name unless absolutely necessary. Days became months. Months became years. 5 long years passed beneath that silence. Children who had once laughed through the corridors grew quieter. Guests stopped visiting. The grand house slowly became known throughout the county as a place wrapped in mourning, where even cheerful conversations seemed to lower their voices before entering through its doors. People spoke of the Earl with sympathy. A few spoke of him with suspicion. Most simply avoided speaking of him altogether. Then, on a gray September morning in 1861, a carriage rolled slowly through the iron gates of Ashcombe Hall. Inside sat a young woman carrying little more than a single trunk, a worn leather satchel, and a letter of recommendation she had read so many times the edges had begun to fray. Her name was Elowen Hartley. She believed she had accepted nothing more than a respectable position as governess to 2 motherless children. She did not know she was stepping into a house where grief still lingered like dust upon forgotten furniture. She did not know the master of the estate had spent 5 years trying to forget a single terrible night. She did not know every servant she would soon meet carried secrets they prayed would never be uncovered. Most of all, she did not know that before winter gave way to spring, She would uncover a truth capable of changing every life inside Ashcombe Hall forever. As the carriage disappeared back down the long gravel drive, Elowen stood alone before the towering stone mansion. A chill breeze swept across the gardens. Somewhere high above, one curtain on the second floor shifted ever so slightly. Someone had been watching her arrive, and whoever it was had been expecting her. The great front doors opened before Elowen had the chance to lift the heavy brass knocker. A woman dressed in a perfectly pressed gray gown stood waiting inside, as though she had known the exact moment the carriage would arrive. She was tall, straight-backed despite her years, with silver threaded neatly through dark hair that had long since forgotten youth. Her face was composed, neither warm nor unfriendly, but marked by the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime keeping a large household running without ever raising her voice.
You must be Miss Hartley. I am. I am Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper. Welcome to Ashcombe Hall.
The words were courteous. Her expression remained impossible to read. A young footman hurried forward to carry Elowen's trunk inside while Mrs. Pruitt stepped aside, allowing the new governess to enter the grand entrance hall. The first thing Elowen noticed was the silence, not the ordinary stillness of a respectable country house, but something deeper. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock seemed unusually loud. No servants hurried across the marble floor. No cheerful voices drifted from distant rooms. It felt as though the house itself had learned not to disturb its own quiet. As Mrs. Pruitt led her through the entrance hall, Elowen found herself studying the portraits lining the walls. Generations of Ashcombes looked down with solemn expressions, each preserved in rich oils and gilded frames. Near the end of the gallery, however, one portrait stood differently from all the others. It faced the wall. Only the back of the heavy frame could be seen. Elowen slowed her steps for a moment. "Has it been taken down for cleaning?" she asked gently. Mrs. Pruitt did not even look toward it. "No, nothing more." The answer was so brief that Elowen understood immediately the subject was not one to pursue. They continued through long corridors where polished floors reflected the afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Every room seemed perfectly maintained, yet strangely untouched, as though beauty had replaced happiness. Finally, Mrs. Pruitt stopped before a narrow staircase leading upward. Room is on the third floor. It was smaller than Elowen had imagined, but pleasant enough. A neat bed stood beneath a dormer window overlooking the gardens. A writing desk rested near the fireplace, and a modest wardrobe occupied one corner of the room. For someone beginning life anew, it was more than sufficient. Mrs. Pruitt placed a ring of household keys on the desk. "Begin lessons with Miss Margaret and Master Henry tomorrow morning. I look forward to meeting them. They are good children." Something softened in the older woman's voice. "They deserve kindness. I shall do my best." Pruitt nodded once. "I believe you will." She turned toward the door, then paused with her hand resting lightly upon the handle. "There is one thing you should know." Elowen waited. "The second-floor east corridor is seldom used." "I understand. The room at the end of that corridor remains locked." Again Elowen simply nodded. "It is not part of your duties." "I see." Pruitt looked directly into her eyes for the first time. Usually calm expression carried the faintest trace of concern. "Miss Hartley?" "Yes. Do you frighten easily?" The question caught Elowen entirely by surprise. She smiled politely. "No, Mrs. Pruitt." The first time since greeting her, the housekeeper seemed to relax. "That is good." She hesitated before adding one final sentence. "And if you value your peace of mind." Her voice became almost a whisper. "Do not go searching for things that are not your concern." Door closed quietly behind her. Elowen remained standing in the center of the room, replaying the strange warning in her thoughts. She had expected rules. She had expected schedules. She had expected lessons, routines, and responsibilities. She had not expected mystery. As evening settled over Ashcombe Hall, she unpacked the few possessions she had brought from Bath. A handful of dresses, several books, writing paper, a small silver locket containing the only portrait she possessed of her late mother. She held it for a long moment before placing it carefully inside the drawer of her bedside table. Outside, darkness slowly covered the estate. The wind stirred the old trees surrounding the house, their branches scraping softly against distant windows. Unable to sleep in unfamiliar surroundings, Elowen wandered quietly to the window. From there she could see much of the eastern wing. One window alone caught her attention. Unlike every other room in the house, it remained completely dark. The locked study. She found herself wondering what kind of grief could keep a room untouched for 5 long years. Then, just as she turned away from the glass, a faint light appeared inside that very window, only for a second, as though someone carrying a candle had crossed the room. Then it vanished. Elowen frowned. Mrs. Pruitt had been quite clear. The room was never opened, so who was inside? Elowen slept little that first night. Each time she closed her eyes, she found herself thinking of the brief light she had seen in the locked study. She had considered the possibility that it was nothing more than a reflection from another window, or perhaps a trick of her tired eyes after a long journey. Yet the image lingered stubbornly in her mind. The light had moved. Of that she was certain. By morning, she had resolved to think no more of it. She had not come to Ashcombe Hall to chase mysteries. She had come to rebuild a life that Bath society had quietly taken from her. Whatever secrets this house carried belonged to its owners, not to a governess employed to teach 2 children. After breakfast, Mrs. Pruitt escorted her to the schoolroom. The room overlooked the south gardens, where autumn had begun painting the trees in shades of gold and amber. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that had clearly belonged to generations of Ashcombe children. A globe stood beside the window, and maps of Europe hung neatly against one wall. Waiting inside were the children. Margaret Ashcombe rose from her chair the moment Elowen entered. She was 9 years old, with dark hair tied neatly behind her head and calm gray eyes that missed very little. There was something remarkably composed about her, something older than her years. She greeted Elowen politely, but her careful gaze suggested she was measuring this new governess long before deciding whether she could be trusted. Beside her sat Henry. Unlike his sister, 6-year-old Henry barely remained seated long enough for introductions. His bright smile filled the room before he had spoken a single word.
Are you really going to teach us every day?
I certainly hope so.
Good. The last governess always looked unhappy.
Henry.
The innocent remark hung in the room a moment longer than anyone expected. Elowen noticed Margaret lower her eyes toward her book. Children, she realized, often spoke truths adults carefully avoided. The morning lessons passed more pleasantly than she had imagined. Margaret possessed an excellent mind for history and literature, while Henry showed endless curiosity, though very little patience for arithmetic. Before long, both children were laughing together over one of Aesop's fables, and for the first time since arriving, Elowen heard genuine happiness echo through the old house. Even Mrs. Pruitt, passing the open schoolroom door, paused for the briefest moment before quietly continuing down the corridor. It had been a long time since laughter had sounded so natural within Ashcombe Hall. Later that afternoon, Margaret led Elowen through the gardens, while Henry chased butterflies across the lawn. "My brother likes you," Margaret said matter-of-factly. "I'm glad." "Usually doesn't." Elowen smiled. "Take that as a compliment." Several moments they walked in comfortable silence. Then Margaret asked quietly, "Did Mrs. Pruitt tell you about Mama?" Elowen chose her answer carefully. "She told me very little." Margaret nodded, as though she had expected nothing else. "No one tells me much either." She stopped beside an old stone bench overlooking the rose garden. "I remember Mama reading to me in the evenings." "Henry, he doesn't remember." Her voice grew softer. "He was too little." A breeze stirred the flowers around them. After a long silence, Margaret spoke again. "Papa still misses her." "I imagine he does. Goes to the second floor sometimes." Elowen felt herself listening more closely. "He stands outside Mama's study." "The locked room?" Margaret looked surprised. "You know about it?" "Only that I'm not supposed to go there." "No one is." "Even your father?" "He never goes inside." Margaret looked toward the house. "He just stands there." Elowen followed her gaze. The eastern windows reflected the afternoon sun. "They say some doors stay locked because people are hiding something." Margaret shook her head. "I don't think Papa is hiding anything." "Do you think?" The little girl was quiet for a long moment. "I think." She searched for the right words. "He's afraid." Those simple words stayed with Elowen long after the conversation ended. That evening, as the household gathered for supper, she met the Earl properly for the first time. Julian Ashcombe entered the dining room with quiet confidence. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 34, dressed with understated elegance rather than unnecessary grandeur. His dark hair was neatly kept, though faint lines around his eyes suggested years of sleepless nights rather than age. Everything about him spoke of discipline, yet when he looked toward Elowen, something unexpected happened. Their eyes met, only for a heartbeat, but in that single moment both seemed strangely unsettled. It was as though each recognized the other without understanding how. Julian recovered first. "Miss Hartley, my lord, I trust the children haven't frightened you away." A faint smile touched Elowen's lips. "Been delightful." Henry beamed proudly. Margaret smiled for what seemed the first time all day. For just a moment, the Earl's expression softened. Then, almost as quickly as it had appeared, the warmth disappeared behind the careful composure he wore like armor. Dinner continued quietly. Yet Elowen could not shake the feeling that something had changed the instant their eyes met. She wasn't the only one. Late that night, after the household had gone to bed, Julian stood alone before the fireplace in his study. His thoughts should have been on estate accounts. Instead, he found himself remembering the new governess's face. It made no sense. They had never met before, and yet, for the first time in 5 years, he could no longer remember whether the face haunting his thoughts belonged to the woman he had just met, or the wife he had lost. He closed his eyes, troubled by the thought. Outside, somewhere deep within the silent corridors of Ashcombe Hall, a floorboard creaked, though no one should have been awake. By the end of her first week at Ashcombe Hall, Elowen Hartley had learned that every great house possessed 2 histories. There was the history visitors admired, written in portraits, polished silver, and family titles stretching back through generations. Then there was the history servants carried. That history was never written down. It was passed in lowered voices over steaming kettles, exchanged in glances across long dining tables, and hidden inside silences that said far more than words ever could. Ashcombe Hall possessed more silence than any house Elowen had ever known. Whenever the Earl's name was mentioned below stairs, conversation slowed. No one spoke ill of him. On the contrary, every servant described Julian Ashcombe as fair, generous, and honorable. Wages were always paid on time. No servant had ever been dismissed without reason. During harsh winters, he quietly ensured that struggling tenant families received coal and bread before they had to ask. Yet despite his kindness, everyone seemed afraid of him, not because of anything he did, because of what grief had turned him into. He was different before, one of the older gardeners remarked while trimming the hedges outside the schoolroom. The hall used to be full of music. Another servant quickly changed the subject before he could say more. It happened often. Whenever conversation drifted toward the years before the Countess's death, someone always found a reason to end it, Elowen noticed. She simply chose not to ask. Instead, she devoted herself to Margaret and Henry. The children responded to routine far more quickly than Mrs. Pruitt had expected. Lessons became lively. Afternoons were spent exploring the gardens or reading beneath the ancient oak tree. And laughter, once rare within the hall, began appearing almost every day. One rainy afternoon, Henry insisted upon building a castle from books and cushions in the nursery. Margaret declared the design architecturally impossible. Henry disagreed with great enthusiasm. Within minutes, all 3 of them were laughing as the carefully balanced tower collapsed around them. Their laughter echoed down the corridor. At that very moment, Julian Ashcombe was passing the nursery on his way to the library. He stopped. It had been years since he had heard his children laughing quite like that. He remained standing outside the half-open door, unnoticed. Henry was pretending to defend the fallen castle with a wooden ruler. Margaret was laughing too hard to continue correcting him. Elowen sat cross-legged upon the carpet, laughing with them instead of at them. For reasons Julian could not explain, the sight tightened something inside his chest. Not painfully, almost, hopefully. He quietly continued down the corridor before anyone realized he had been there. That evening, as was his custom, he asked Elowen to join him in the library after supper to discuss the children's progress. The library was warm despite the autumn chill outside. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes collected by generations of Ashcombes. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting golden light across the room. Julian stood near the mantelpiece when Elowen entered. "Please, Miss Hartley." He gestured toward one of the armchairs. She thanked him and took the offered seat. For several moments they spoke only of Margaret's remarkable reading ability and Henry's endless imagination. Then the conversation unexpectedly drifted elsewhere. "Noticed," Julian said quietly, "that my children smile more often." Elowen looked down modestly. "Wonderful children, my lord. They simply needed someone willing to listen." Julian nodded slowly. "I fear there were years when I did not." His voice carried no self-pity, only regret. Elowen hesitated before answering. "Grief asks impossible things of people." He looked at her with quiet surprise. "You speak as though you've known it." Lost my mother when I was very young. I'm sorry. I scarcely remember her face. She smiled sadly. But one still misses what one never truly had. Julian stared into the fire. I believed time would lessen grief. Did it? No, he answered so softly she almost didn't hear him. It merely taught me how to hide it. Silence settled comfortably between them. It was not awkward. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who understood that some sorrows required no explanation. Finally, Julian rose. Taken enough of your evening? Haven't. The words escaped before Elowen realized she had spoken them. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Julian smiled. It was small, almost hesitant, but it transformed his face completely. For the first time, Elowen understood why the county had once described him as charming. Grief had not erased that man. It had simply hidden him. As she rose to leave, her eyes wandered toward a small silver frame resting upon the mantel. It contained no portrait, only an empty space where one had clearly once been. Julian noticed her glance. My wife's portrait used to stand there. He spoke before she could apologize. I removed it. Elowen looked back at him. May I ask why? He was quiet for several seconds. Because I found myself speaking to it. His answer carried such quiet honesty that Elowen felt her heart ache. I realized one day, he looked into the dying fire, that I could remember every detail of her portrait. He swallowed. But I was beginning to forget the sound of her laughter. Neither spoke again. Elowen quietly wished him good night and stepped into the corridor. As she disappeared around the corner, Julian remained standing beside the fire, for the first time in 5 years. The library no longer felt quite so empty. Yet upstairs, behind the locked door at the end of the east corridor, something waited patiently in the darkness. A truth that had remained hidden for 5 long years, and before many more weeks had passed, it would begin revealing itself. Autumn settled gently over Ashcombe Hall, wrapping the ancient estate in mornings of silver mist and evenings scented with damp earth and burning wood. The days slipped into a comfortable rhythm. Lessons filled the mornings, walks through the gardens occupied the afternoons, and quiet conversations by the library fire often ended the evenings. To anyone passing through the estate, it would have appeared that life was finally returning to normal. Yet beneath that calm, Elowen sensed an uneasiness that never truly disappeared. It revealed itself in the smallest moments. Whenever a servant crossed the east corridor, they unconsciously quickened their pace. Whenever the Countess's name was mentioned, even accidentally, the room fell silent. And whenever Julian climbed the staircase after nightfall, Mrs. Pruitt would pause whatever she was doing and watch until he disappeared from sight. One afternoon, while searching for a misplaced geography book, Elowen wandered farther along the second floor than she usually did. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting long golden rectangles across the polished floor. The hallway was empty. At its far end stood the familiar door, the locked study. She stopped several paces away, reminding herself of Mrs. Pruitt's warning. Do not go searching for things that are not your concern. Several moments she simply stood there. It was remarkable how ordinary the door appeared. Dark oak, a polished brass handle. No sign that it concealed the greatest sorrow in the house. She told herself she would only look. Nothing more. Slowly she walked toward it. As she drew closer, she noticed something she had somehow overlooked before. Fresh white roses rested in a crystal vase beside the door. They could not have been there long. Their petals were still covered with tiny drops of water. Someone had placed them there that very morning. Elowen frowned. Who would leave fresh flowers outside a room no one entered? She reached out almost without thinking, her fingers hovering above the brass handle. At that exact moment, a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned sharply. The corridor was empty, only silence greeted her. For a brief second she wondered if she had imagined the sound. Then another board creaked, closer this time. Her heartbeat quickened. Is someone there? No answer came. The hallway remained still. After several uneasy moments, she stepped away from the door and began walking back toward the staircase. Only when she reached the corner did she glance over her shoulder. She froze. The vase of white roses was gone. She blinked. Surely she had mistaken herself. She hurried back. The flowers were exactly where they had been before. She stared at them, confused. Had fear played tricks on her eyes, or had someone moved them while she wasn't looking? That evening, unable to shake the strange encounter, Elowen mentioned the flowers to Margaret as they sorted books in the schoolroom. The white roses outside your mother's study. Margaret looked up immediately. What about them? Who places them there? The little girl's expression became thoughtful. I don't know. You've never seen anyone. Margaret slowly shook her head. Just always there. Always, every Monday, Elowen frowned. No one knows who leaves them. Margaret lowered her voice. I asked Cook once. What did she say? She said some questions are better left alone. Answer unsettled Elowen far more than she cared to admit. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, she passed through the servants' corridor on her way upstairs. Voices drifted from the pantry. She recognized Mrs. Prewitt's calm tone and another servant she believed to be the head gardener. It cannot remain hidden forever, the gardener whispered. It must, Mrs. Prewitt replied firmly. Earl has suffered enough. If someone discovers the truth, a long silence followed. Finally Mrs. Prewitt answered. Then heaven help us all. Elowen stood perfectly still. She knew she should continue walking. Instead, she listened. The gardener spoke again. Do you think Miss Hartley suspects anything? Mrs. Prewitt answered without hesitation. Yet, a chair scraped softly across the floor. Elowen realized the conversation had ended. Before either servant emerged, she quietly slipped away and climbed the back staircase to her room. Sleep did not come easily. The house seemed different now, not haunted, not cursed, simply waiting for someone to ask the wrong question, waiting for someone to open the wrong door, waiting for a truth that had remained buried for 5 years. As midnight approached, Elowen rose from her bed and crossed quietly to the window. The moon hung low above the eastern wing. Its pale light fell directly upon the second-floor corridor windows. Then, she saw him. A solitary figure stood outside the locked study, Julian. He neither knocked nor entered. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the closed door. His head was bowed, as though speaking to someone on the other side. After a long moment, he turned away and disappeared into the darkness. But before he did, Elowen could have sworn she heard him whisper a single word. Forgive me. The following morning, Elowen tried to convince herself that she had imagined the Earl's whispered words. Distance could deceive the eyes. The wind could carry sounds that were never truly spoken. There were perfectly reasonable explanations for what she had seen from her bedroom window. And yet, as she entered the breakfast room, she found Julian already there, quietly reading the Morning Post. He looked as composed as ever. No one seeing him now would have guessed he had stood outside a locked door long after midnight. When he looked up, their eyes met. Good morning, Miss Hartley. Morning, my lord. His voice was steady, but there was a weariness about him that had not been there before. It was subtle, hidden beneath perfect manners, yet Elowen noticed it all the same. She was beginning to notice everything about him. The day passed peacefully. Margaret showed remarkable progress in her French lessons, while Henry proudly declared that arithmetic was slightly less dreadful than the week before. By afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the estate, and before long a steady rain drummed against the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall. Their planned walk was abandoned. Instead, Elowen gathered the children in the small sitting room near the nursery. What shall we do? Henry asked with exaggerated disappointment. We could read, Margaret suggested. We always read. Elowen smiled. Then perhaps today we'll tell stories. Henry's face lit up. Real stories, the very best kind. She began telling them an old tale her father had loved as a boy, about a traveler who discovered that courage often arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary kindness. As the rain beat gently against the windows, both children listened with complete attention. They did not notice someone standing just outside the room. Julian had been on his way to his study when he heard Elowen's voice. He paused in the doorway. For several minutes, he simply listened. The sound of her gentle narration mingled with the children's laughter, filling the corridor with a warmth the house had not known in years. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. It reminded him of another voice. Caroline had once read stories in much the same way, not because the words were extraordinary, but because she believed every child deserved to feel safe while hearing them. The memory struck him unexpectedly, for the first time in years. It no longer brought only pain. When the story ended, Henry applauded enthusiastically, laughed, one at a time. Julian quietly continued on his way before anyone realized he had been listening. That evening after supper, Elowen carried Margaret's lesson books to the library, expecting to leave them on the desk and return upstairs. Instead, Julian looked up from the account spread before him. Would you stay for a few moments? Of course. He closed the ledger. I wanted to thank you. There is no need. There is. He leaned back slightly. I heard the children laughing today. Elowen smiled. They make it very easy. He shook his head gently. You make them feel safe enough to laugh. Sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She lowered her eyes modestly. They're remarkable children, my lord. They are. A thoughtful silence settled between them. Julian rose and walked toward the bookshelf. My wife believed this room should never become merely a place for business. He removed a well-worn novel. She insisted every library ought to contain stories capable of making people forget themselves for a while. He handed the book to Elowen. It was one of her favorites. Elowen accepted it carefully. Kept it all these years. Kept everything. The words escaped before he could soften them. He gave a quiet, almost embarrassed smile. Perhaps that has been my greatest mistake. Elowen looked around the room, the books, the portraits, the untouched furniture. Nothing seemed to have changed in years. Sometimes, she said gently, holding on is the only way we know how to survive. Julian regarded her for a long moment. And when does surviving become living again? It was not a question he expected her to answer, yet she did. I think. She chose her words carefully. It begins the day we stop feeling guilty for smiling. Neither spoke after that. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Julian looked into the flames. I smiled today. Elowen looked at him. So did I. Their eyes met. For just a heartbeat, the silence between them felt effortless. Neither realized that Mrs. Pruitt had paused outside the library door moments earlier. She had seen the Earl smiling. A genuine smile. The first she could remember since the Countess's death. She quietly walked away before either of them noticed her. There was relief in her heart, but also concern, because she had seen this house offer hope before, and she knew how quickly hope could be broken. Later that night, as Elowen climbed the staircase to her room, she noticed something tucked beneath her bedroom door, a folded piece of paper. There was no name written on it, no seal. She unfolded it slowly. Only 6 words appeared in neat handwriting. Stop asking about the locked room or the next secret. We'll bury you too. Elowen read the note 3 times before the meaning truly settled over her. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and entirely unfamiliar. There was no signature, no crest pressed into the paper, nothing that might reveal who had slipped it beneath her door while the household slept. She turned the sheet over. It was blank. For a brief moment, she considered taking it straight to Mrs. Pruitt. It was, after all, the sensible thing to do, yet something held her back. If the note had come from someone within Ashcombe Hall, revealing it too quickly might only cause its sender to become more careful. She folded the paper, placed it inside the drawer of her writing desk, and resolved to speak of it to no one. Not yet. The following afternoon, the quiet routine of the house was interrupted by the sound of carriage wheels crunching over the gravel drive. Henry rushed to the nursery window. Someone's coming. Margaret looked up from her embroidery. Perhaps it's Uncle Edmund. Before anyone could answer, a footman appeared at the schoolroom door. My lord requests that Miss Hartley and the children join him in the drawing room. A few minutes later, Elowen entered behind Margaret and Henry. Standing beside the fireplace was a gentleman a few years younger than the Earl. He was impeccably dressed, with chestnut hair, bright blue eyes, and an easy smile that seemed practiced rather than spontaneous. Confidence surrounded him as naturally as perfume. Julian stepped forward. Miss Hartley, allow me to introduce my younger brother, Mr. Edmund Ashcombe. Edmund bowed gracefully. So this is the governess I've heard so much about. Elowen returned the greeting politely. I hope you've heard only good things. Oh, indeed. His smile widened. My brother is not easily impressed, Miss Hartley. The fact that he speaks well of you is praise of the highest order. Julian gave his brother a mildly disapproving look. You exaggerate. Do I? Edmund laughed, and for a moment the room felt lighter. Henry ran eagerly toward his uncle. Did you bring me something? I never arrive empty-handed. From his coat pocket, Edmund produced a small carved wooden horse. Henry's face lit up with delight. Margaret thanked her uncle politely. Though Elowen noticed, she remained far more reserved than her brother. Throughout luncheon, Edmund entertained the table with amusing stories from London, drawing laughter from nearly everyone present. Nearly everyone. Elowen found him pleasant enough, yet something about him unsettled her in a way she could not explain. Perhaps it was the way his smile disappeared the instant he believed no one was watching, or the way his eyes lingered on the house itself, as though measuring something far more valuable than its beauty. Later that afternoon, while Henry happily played with his new toy in the gardens, Margaret walked quietly beside Elowen. Do you like Uncle Edmund? The little girl asked. Only just met him. Margaret looked toward the house before lowering her voice. Mama didn't. Elowen stopped walking. What makes you say that? Margaret hesitated. I wasn't supposed to hear. What? The week before Mama died. The child stared at the ground. I woke up during the night. She spoke so softly that Elowen almost missed the words. I heard shouting. Was shouting? Mama, your uncle, Margaret nodded. They were arguing in the study. You hear what they were saying? She shook her head. Only one thing. Elowen waited. Mama said. Margaret swallowed nervously. I won't let you ruin this family. A chill ran through Elowen despite the warmth of the afternoon. What happened then? I don't know. Margaret looked genuinely distressed. Nurse found me in the hallway and took me back to bed. You ever tell your father? I tried. And he said I must have been dreaming. For several moments, neither spoke. Children often misunderstood what they overheard, but they rarely invented memories entirely. That evening, after the children had gone upstairs, Elowen crossed the entrance hall carrying a stack of books. As she reached the foot of the staircase, she heard voices drifting from the Earl's study. Julian and Edmund, the door was not fully closed. You should let the past rest, Edmund was saying. It has rested long enough, Julian replied calmly. There is nothing to gain by reopening old wounds. There are questions that have never been answered. A pause followed, then Edmund laughed lightly. My dear brother, grief has a way of inventing mysteries where none exist. Elowen moved quietly on before she could hear more, but one sentence lingered in her thoughts. Grief has a way of inventing mysteries. Did Edmund truly believe that? Or was he hopping Julian wood later that night? Elowen opened the drawer of her desk and looked again at the anonymous note. Then she thought of Margaret's whispered memory. I won't let you ruin this family. Secrets, 2 warnings, and somehow. Both now seemed to point toward the same man. Still, Elowen reminded herself that suspicion was not proof. She had known Edmund only a single day. It would be unfair and dangerous to judge him so quickly. Yet as she extinguished her candle and prepared for bed, one unsettling thought refused to leave her. If Caroline had truly feared Edmund, why had no one ever spoken of it? And who had worked so hard to ensure that silence lasted for 5 long years? The memory of Margaret's words stayed with Elowen for the rest of the week. I won't let you ruin this family. She repeated the sentence silently whenever she found herself alone. Children could misunderstand conversations, especially those overheard late at night. Yet Margaret had spoken with the quiet certainty of someone recalling a moment she had never forgotten. Still, a single memory was not enough to accuse a man. Elowen knew she needed facts. An opportunity came sooner than she expected. Mrs. Pruitt handed her a list of supplies needed for the schoolroom and asked if she would travel to the nearby market town. It was a simple errand, one Elowen gladly accepted after spending weeks almost entirely within the grounds of Ashcombe Hall. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing as the carriage rolled into the bustling town square. After purchasing slates, ink, and several new readers for Henry, Elowen found herself standing across the street from the office of Mr. Alfred Whitmore, the estate solicitor, the same man she remembered, whose letter had helped secure her position at Ashcombe Hall. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the street. Mr. Whitmore welcomed her warmly. Miss Hartley, what a pleasant surprise. I hope I'm not disturbing you. At all. After a few minutes of polite conversation, Elowen carefully chose her next words. Been reading history with Miss Margaret. The old solicitor smiled. A worthy subject. Led us to speaking about Lady Ashcombe. His smile faded ever so slightly. I see. I hope you won't think my question improper. He folded his hands upon his desk. Ask it. Often wondered how such a terrible accident could happen in a house so carefully maintained. Several seconds, Mr. Whitmore remained silent. Finally, he walked to a cabinet and withdrew a worn leather folder. The coroner's report is part of the public record. He placed it gently before her, though I confess few people have ever wished to read it. Elowen thanked him quietly and opened the file. The report was brief: date, time, medical findings, witness statements. Everything appeared painfully ordinary. The Countess had fallen. The injuries matched the staircase. Death had been immediate. The verdict was unmistakable. Accidental death. Elowen was about to close the folder when a single sentence near the bottom caught her eye. The deceased was found holding one white kid glove. The matching glove was not recovered despite a thorough search of the premises. She frowned. The missing glove, such an insignificant detail. Yet it had been mentioned twice, once in the report, and once by the servants years earlier. Why include it if it meant nothing, Mr. Whitmore noticed her expression. Curious, isn't it? You remember it. I remember everything about that dreadful week. What became of the other glove? The solicitor slowly shook his head. No one ever found it. Surely someone must have looked. The house was searched from cellar to attic. Nothing Nothing. He leaned back thoughtfully. The coroner believed the second glove had simply been misplaced before the accident. You don't? For a brief moment, the old man's eyes met hers. There are details in life that appear too small to matter. He paused, until years later. Before Elowen could ask another question, a clerk entered with several ledgers requiring Mr. Whitmore's attention. She understood the conversation had ended. After thanking him for his kindness, she stepped back into the afternoon sunshine. Yet instead of returning immediately to the waiting carriage, she wandered slowly through the market square. Her thoughts were no longer on school books or ink bottles. They were on a single missing glove. Why had Caroline still been holding one glove when she fell? Where had the other gone? And why had no one ever found it? By the time Elowen returned to Ashcombe Hall, dusk had begun settling across the estate. Henry ran eagerly to greet her. "Did you bring my sweets?" she laughed. "I believe there may be one or two." His delighted cheer echoed through the entrance hall. Margaret smiled as well. Only Julian noticed that something weighed upon Elowen's thoughts. That evening, after the children had retired, he found her standing alone beside one of the tall drawing-room windows. "Had something on your mind since returning?" She turned, slightly surprised. "Is it so obvious?" Only to someone who has spent years pretending nothing is wrong. She hesitated, then carefully she asked, "My lord, may I ask you something?" "You may. Do you remember the night Lady Ashcombe died?" A shadow crossed his face. "Remember every moment." The coroner mentioned she was holding a white glove. Julian looked away toward the dark gardens. "Yes, the other was never found." "No. That ever trouble you?" For a long time he said nothing. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It troubles me still." He looked back at her. "Because I know my wife." His eyes grew distant. "Caroline never misplaced anything." Room fell silent in that moment. Elowen realized something important. Julian had never truly believed the official story either, and somewhere within Ashcombe Hall, the answer to the mystery of the missing glove had been waiting, all along. The first frost arrived on the morning of October 23rd. Ashcombe Hall looked beautiful beneath the pale light of dawn. The gardens glittered with silver, the hedges shimmered with ice, and a thin mist drifted across the lawns like a veil. Yet despite the beauty outside, an unusual heaviness settled over the house. The servants spoke more softly than usual. Even Henry, who rarely noticed changes in the moods of adults, sensed that something was different. "Why is everyone so quiet today?" He whispered to Elowen during breakfast. Before she could answer, Margaret lowered her spoon. "It's today," Henry frowned. "What is?" Margaret looked toward their father, who sat silently at the head of the table. "The day Mama died." The room became still. Julian's hand paused over his teacup, but he said nothing. A few moments later, he quietly excused himself and left the dining room. Henry immediately looked guilty. "I didn't mean." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her brother's hand. "I know." After breakfast, Mrs. Pruitt approached Elowen. "The children will have no formal lessons today." "Of course. It has always been the family's custom." Elowen nodded. She needed no further explanation. The anniversary of Caroline Ashcombe's death had become a day unlike any other. By midday, every member of the household had found quiet work to occupy themselves. Cook baked fresh bread no one seemed eager to eat. The gardeners trimmed hedges that scarcely needed trimming. Even the footmen moved with unusual care, as though afraid that loud footsteps might disturb old memories. Curiosity drew Elowen toward the east corridor once more. This time, she did not intend to approach the locked study. She simply wished to understand why grief still seemed to command the entire house after 5 long years. As she reached the corridor, she stopped. Fresh white roses stood beside the study door once again. Only today there were far more than before. A dozen perfect blooms rested in a crystal vase, their fragrance filling the otherwise silent hallway. Elowen looked around. The corridor was empty. She stepped closer. Beneath the vase lay a folded piece of cream-colored paper. She glanced over her shoulder one last time before carefully unfolding it. There were only 5 handwritten words. She deserved the truth, nothing else. No name, no explanation. Elowen's pulse quickened. Someone had left this deliberately, not as a threat this time, but as a message. Before she could examine it further, footsteps echoed from the staircase. She quickly slipped the note into the pocket of her dress. Mrs. Pruitt appeared moments later. For the first time since Elowen had known her, the housekeeper looked genuinely startled. "Miss Hartley, I'm sorry, I was only passing through." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes briefly rested on the roses, then on the study door. "You should return downstairs." Her tone was gentle, but firm, As they walked together, Elowen finally gathered the courage to ask. "Mrs. Pruitt?" "Yes." "Who leaves the roses?" The older woman slowed. For a moment, Elowen thought she might finally answer. Instead, Mrs. Pruitt sighed softly. "I have worked in this house for 25 years. I know. I have seen children born." She smiled sadly. "I have buried people I loved." They continued walking. When grief is deep enough. Pruitt looked ahead rather than at Elowen. People find their own ways of remembering. She said nothing more. That evening, after supper, Julian asked if Elowen would accompany him for a short walk through the gardens. The air was cold, but the sky had cleared, revealing hundreds of stars above the ancient estate. For several minutes they walked without speaking. Finally, Julian stopped beside a weathered stone bench overlooking the lake. "My wife loved this place." Elowen remained quiet. He rarely spoke of Caroline. "When we were first married," he continued, "she insisted the gardens should never look too perfect." Elowen smiled faintly. "Why?" She said flowers were happiest when allowed to grow where they pleased. A gentle laugh escaped him. It drove the gardeners to despair. Smile faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Spent 5 years trying not to remember stories like that. He looked across the still water. But today, his voice softened. "I realized I'm more afraid of forgetting her than remembering her." Elowen looked at him with quiet compassion. "I don't think love asks us to choose between remembering and living." He turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "I think," she spoke carefully, "those we've loved would want us to carry them forward." She looked toward the hall. "Lock them away." Julian was silent for a long time, then he nodded almost imperceptibly. When they returned to the house, the east wing was dark. Everyone had retired, everyone, except one person. As Elowen climbed the staircase, she glanced instinctively toward the second-floor corridor. A shadow stood beside the locked study. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't Mrs. Pruitt. The figure was taller, broader. And as moonlight briefly crossed the corridor, Elowen recognized him, Edmund. He looked around to be certain he was alone. Then, with surprising familiarity, he reached into his pocket and produced a key. Elowen stood frozen on the staircase. The moonlight pouring through the tall window illuminated the second-floor corridor just enough for her to see Edmund clearly. He glanced over his shoulder once, as though making certain no one had followed him. Then he slipped the key into the lock. The door opened. Only a few inches. Edmund disappeared inside, closing it quietly behind him. Elowen's heart pounded. For 5 years, no one had been permitted to enter Caroline Ashcombe's study. That was what everyone had believed. Yet Edmund had entered as though he had done so before. She remained where she was, scarcely daring to breathe. A dozen thoughts raced through her mind. Should she tell Julian? Should she wake Mrs. Pruitt, or should she discover for herself what Edmund was hiding? Before she could decide, the study door opened again. Edmund stepped back into the corridor. He locked the door, returned the key to his pocket, and walked away with the same calm confidence he had carried all evening. Only after his footsteps disappeared did Elowen finally move. She hurried quietly to her room, but sleep never came. She could think of only one thing. Why did Edmund have a key? The answer did not come the next day. Instead, life at Ashcombe Hall seemed determined to continue as though nothing unusual had happened. Julian spent the morning inspecting the estate. Margaret worked diligently through her history lesson. Henry insisted on showing everyone the bird's nest he had discovered beneath an old oak tree. Only Elowen carried the previous night's secret. She watched Edmund carefully throughout breakfast. He appeared perfectly at ease. He laughed easily. He spoke warmly with his brother. No trace of guilt crossed his face. If she had not seen him herself, she might have doubted her own memory. Late that afternoon, however, the household's peaceful routine was suddenly broken. Henry collapsed with a fever. By sunset his cheeks burned with heat, and his small body trembled beneath the blankets. Mrs. Pruitt immediately sent a groom to fetch the village doctor. Julian refused to leave his son's bedside. Elowen remained with them through the evening, cooling Henry's forehead with damp cloths and reading softly whenever the little boy drifted in and out of sleep. Near midnight, Mrs. Pruitt quietly entered the room. "We need more blankets." "Fetch them," Elowen volunteered. "There are fresh linens in the second-floor cupboard." Elowen nodded and hurried into the dark hallway carrying a single candle. The house was silent. Every servant was occupied with Henry's illness. She found the linen cupboard exactly where Mrs. Pruitt had described. As she gathered several heavy blankets into her arms, something caught her eye, the study door. It stood slightly open, only an inch, just enough for a thin line of darkness to show between the frame and the door. Elowen frowned. She clearly remembered Edmund locking it the previous night. Perhaps someone had forgotten to close it properly. She should ignore it, return to Henry. Forget everything she had seen, instead. Curiosity overcame caution. Balancing the blankets on one arm, she stepped toward the door. She placed 2 fingers lightly against it. It opened without a sound. The air inside was cool and carried the faint scent of lavender and old paper. Elowen hesitated. 5 years of silence seemed to fill the room. Then she crossed the threshold. Nothing had changed. Dust rested undisturbed upon the bookshelves. A shawl remained folded over the back of an armchair. An unfinished embroidery hoop lay beside the window exactly where its owner had left it years before. It did not feel like entering an abandoned room. It felt like entering a life interrupted. Her candlelight wandered slowly across the study. Books, letters, a writing desk, a vase that still held the dried remains of flowers long since faded. Then her gaze settled upon a small portrait hidden behind a row of books. It seemed almost deliberately concealed. She reached for it. Carefully brushing away the dust, she lifted it into the candlelight, her breath caught. The woman in the portrait looked astonishingly familiar, not because Elowen had ever met her, but because she had seen that face every day of her life. With trembling hands, Elowen reached into the pocket of her dress and removed the small silver locket she always carried. She opened it. Inside was the faded miniature portrait of her late mother. She looked from the locket to the portrait, back again. The same gentle eyes. The same smile. The same face. For a long moment, the room seemed to spin around her. What was a portrait of her mother doing inside Caroline Ashcombe's private study? Before she could gather another thought, a floorboard creaked in the corridor outside. Someone was coming. The sound of footsteps drew closer. Elowen's heart pounded so fiercely she feared whoever was approaching would hear it before they reached the doorway. She quickly returned the portrait to the shelf exactly as she had found it, though her trembling hands struggled to place it neatly behind the books. The candle flame flickered as she turned toward the door, searching desperately for somewhere to hide. The footsteps stopped. For one unbearable moment, all she heard was the soft crackle of her candle and the pounding of her own heartbeat. Then the footsteps continued down the corridor. Whoever it was had walked past the study without entering. Elowen released a slow breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She should leave. She knew she should. Henry was ill. Julian would soon notice she had been gone too long. Yet the portrait of her mother had raised a question too enormous to ignore. Why had Caroline Ashcombe kept it hidden? Her eyes returned to the writing desk. Unlike the rest of the room, one drawer sat slightly open, as though someone had closed it in haste years ago and never returned to finish the task. Almost against her own will, Elowen stepped closer. Inside lay neatly stacked papers, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. On top rested a single folded letter. It had never been sealed. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "To Mr. Alfred Whitmore, Solicitor, Bath," the very man whose office Elowen had visited only days before. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle pages. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the writing remained clear. "My dear Mr. Whitmore, if this letter reaches you, I pray you will forgive both its unusual nature and the delay with which it has been written. There is a matter upon my conscience that has burdened me for many years, and I find I can no longer ignore it." Elowen read on, scarcely breathing. Caroline wrote of a young woman she had known in Bath many years earlier, a woman whose reputation had been destroyed after careless gossip spread through society. Caroline admitted, with heartbreaking honesty, that although she had not started the rumor herself, she had remained silent when she could have stopped it. That silence had changed another woman's life forever. As Elowen continued reading, her hands began to shake. The letter mentioned the woman's name, Elowen Hartley, her mother. The room seemed to fall away beneath her. Caroline had known her mother, not only known her. She had carried guilt over what had happened for years. The letter continued. "I have since learned that Mrs. Hartley died, leaving behind a young daughter. If Providence should ever allow it, I wish to see that child given opportunities her mother was denied. I seek neither forgiveness nor recognition, only the chance to make some small amends before it is too late." Tears filled Elowen's eyes. She read the final unfinished lines. "Should anything happen to me before these arrangements are completed, I ask that you do what you believe I would have done." The sentence ended there. The pen stroke simply stopped, as though Caroline had intended to return a few moments later, and never had. Elowen lowered the letter slowly. Her entire life had changed in the space of a few pages. She had believed coming to Ashcombe Hall was a coincidence, a fortunate recommendation from a family solicitor. Now she understood. Someone had quietly guided her here. Not Julian, not Mrs. Pruitt, Caroline herself. Even in death, the Countess's unfinished kindness had reached across 5 years to place Elowen beneath the roof of Ashcombe Hall. A sudden voice shattered the silence. "Miss Hartley." Julian. He stood in the doorway. His eyes moved from Elowen to the letter in her hands, then slowly around the room he had not entered in 5 years. Shock spread across his face, not anger, not accusation, only profound sadness. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Julian stepped into the room. His gaze rested upon the unfinished letter. I wondered. His voice was barely above a whisper, whether someone would eventually find it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound in the study was the faint crackle of Elowen's candle. Julian stood just inside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the letter in her trembling hands. The room around them had remained untouched for 5 years, yet in a single night its silence had finally been broken. Elowen lowered her gaze. "My lord, I am so sorry. You were told never to enter. Yet you did." She nodded, unable to deny it. "I won't insult you by pretending it was an accident." To her surprise, Julian gave the faintest smile. "No, wasn't." He stepped farther into the room, his fingers brushing lightly across the back of Caroline's chair. "I locked this door because I believed I could lock away my grief with it." His eyes wandered slowly around the study. "I was wrong." Sadness in his voice was so quiet that it hurt to hear. Elowen looked down at the unfinished letter. "I never imagined." She struggled to steady herself. "That Lady Ashcombe knew my mother. Neither did I." Julian answered honestly. "I had never seen that letter." "Hadn't?" He slowly shook his head. "After Caroline died, I couldn't bear to sort through her papers." He looked toward the desk. "I closed the door and convinced myself I would return when I was stronger." A weary smile touched his lips. 5 years passed. Silence settled between them once again. Finally, Elowen gathered her courage. "My lord?" "Yes, there is something I must ask." He nodded. She took a careful breath. "Lady Ashcombe truly fall by accident?" Julian closed his eyes. For several seconds he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with memories he had carried alone for far too long. "I have asked myself that question every day for 5 years. He walked slowly toward the window. "The official report called it an accident. You never believed it." "I wanted to." He turned back toward her. "I wanted to believe it because the alternative was unbearable." His face had become pale. "That evening Caroline asked me to meet her in the library after supper." "What happened?" "I was delayed by estate business." He paused. "When I finally left my study, I heard voices upstairs." "Whose?" "Caroline's." "And a brother's." Elowen felt her breath catch. They were arguing. Julian looked down at his hands. "I couldn't hear every word." "What did you hear?" He frowned, searching his memory. Caroline kept saying. His voice grew quieter. "This ends tonight." He swallowed. "Edmund told her she was making a terrible mistake. Next thing I heard," he stopped, "was the scream." His eyes filled with pain. "I reached the staircase only moments later. Lady Ashcombe, she was already lying there." Elowen spoke softly. "Edmund there?" "No, he had disappeared." The room fell silent again. "Did you ask him where he'd been?" "I did." "What did he say?" Julian gave a bitter smile. "He claimed he had gone outside for air." "You believed him?" "I wanted to." His answer came almost immediately. "He was my younger brother." He looked toward the dying flowers still resting in their vase. "I had no proof. Witness, evidence, only questions." He sighed deeply. "And questions are not enough to accuse a man of murder." The word seemed to linger in the room. Neither had spoken it before. Murder. It changed everything. Elowen slowly unfolded the unfinished letter once more. "My lord." She looked at him steadily. "Your wife was trying to help my family. I know that now. Someone threatened me only days ago to stop asking about this room." Julian's expression changed instantly. "Threatened you?" She reached into her pocket and handed him the anonymous note. He read it once, then again, the color drained from his face. "I should have told you sooner," Elowen admitted. "You should never have faced this alone." His voice was firm now. "No more secrets, Miss Hartley." He folded the note carefully. "If someone in this house wishes to keep the past buried," his eyes met hers, "then we shall discover why." At that very moment, a sudden gust of wind swept through the partially open window. The candle flame flickered wildly. A loose sheet of paper slid from beneath the desk and drifted across the floor. Julian bent to retrieve it. His expression froze. It wasn't part of Caroline's handwriting. It was an estate ledger. and beside one unusually large payment, someone had written a single name, Edmund. Julian stared at the ledger in silence. The room suddenly felt colder. Elowen stepped beside him, holding the candle lower so they could both read the faded page. It was an estate account from 5 years earlier, only weeks before Caroline's death. Most of the entries were ordinary. Payments to gardeners, repairs to the roof, wages for the staff. Then one entry stood apart. A large sum had been withdrawn from the estate. Beside it, written in a hurried hand, was a single note. Approved by Edmund. Julian frowned. That cannot be right. Not, Elowen asked. My brother had no authority to approve payments from the estate. He carefully turned another page, then another. Each contained similar entries, different dates, different amounts, the same name, Edmund. Julian's face grew pale. Never saw these. Kept the estate accounts. Our steward. Where is he now? He retired 2 years after Caroline died. Julian looked troubled. I thought it was because of his health. Elowen remained silent. The more they discovered, the more the pieces began to fit together. Caroline had argued with Edmund. She had spoken of ending something. Large sums of money had disappeared, and only days later, she was dead. Julian closed the ledger carefully. We cannot accuse him based on this alone. I know. We can begin asking questions. He nodded. The first time in years, he looked around Caroline's study. I believe we are finally asking the right ones. The following morning, Ashcombe Hall appeared unchanged. Breakfast was served. The children laughed over Henry's attempt to butter his own toast. Mrs. Pruitt supervised the servants as efficiently as ever. Only Julian and Elowen knew that everything had changed. Neither mentioned the ledger, not while anyone else could hear. After breakfast, Julian requested that Mrs. Pruitt join him in the library. When she entered, she immediately sensed something was wrong. My lord, Julian placed the ledger on the table. Have you ever seen this, Mrs. Pruitt adjusted her spectacles. The moment she read Edmund's name, her hands began to tremble. Remember these accounts? Do, Lady Caroline questioned them. Julian looked up sharply. She questioned the payments. Mrs. Pruitt nodded slowly. Several days before, she stopped herself. Before her death. What did she say, Mrs.? Pruitt closed her eyes, searching her memory. She believed money was disappearing from the estate. She tell you where it was going? No. Only that she intended to confront someone. Julian exchanged a glance with Elowen. Neither needed to ask who that someone had been. Mrs. Pruitt looked from one face to the other. Opened her study. It wasn't a question. Julian answered quietly. Yes. A long moment the old housekeeper said nothing. Then, to Elowen's surprise, tears filled her eyes. I prayed this day would come. You knew something all these years? Julian asked. I knew enough to worry. Never enough to prove. She lowered her voice. I always believed your wife was frightened. Frightened of whom, Mrs. Pruitt hesitated, then she whispered the name, Edmund. The room fell silent. Julian looked away, struggling to absorb what he had just heard. So I wasn't imagining it. No, my lord. Pruitt shook her head sadly. You were grieving. Grief does not invent every fear. That afternoon, another unexpected discovery was made. Henry came running into the garden, breathless with excitement. Miss Hartley, what is it? I found something. He held out a small object covered in dirt. I was digging beside the old rose bushes. Elowen took it gently. After brushing away the soil, she stared in disbelief. It was a white kid glove, old, weathered by years beneath the earth, but unmistakably elegant. Only one glove, the left hand. Elowen's pulse quickened. She remembered the coroner's report. Lady Caroline had died holding the right glove. The matching left glove had never been found until now. And it had been buried, not lost. Elowen held the glove so carefully that it almost seemed alive. Though stained with dirt and faded by time, the fine white leather was unmistakable. Along the wrist were the embroidered initials C.A. Caroline Ashcombe. Henry looked up proudly. Did I find something important? Elowen forced a gentle smile. I believe you did. Just then, Julian stepped into the garden. What have you found? Without a word, Elowen placed the glove in his hand. The color drained from his face. No. He turned it over slowly, his fingers trembling. This can't be. Matches the description in the coroner's report, Elowen said quietly. Julian looked toward the old rose bushes. Where exactly did Henry find it? Henry pointed excitedly. Right there, beside the big stone. Julian walked to the spot. The roses had grown thick over the years, hiding the ground beneath them. Kneeling carefully, he examined the soil. It didn't simply fall here, he murmured. It was buried. Pruitt, who had followed them into the garden, covered her mouth in shock. Remember these roses? Julian looked up. They weren't here before Caroline died. Pruitt's voice shook. They were planted a few weeks afterward. Planted them, she hesitated, then answered. Edmund. Silence swept over the garden, even the birds seemed to stop singing. Julian stared at the flower bed as memories rushed back. Remember now? Said Caroline had always wanted roses here. Pruitt slowly shook her head. Never did. Elowen felt a chill run down her spine. If Edmund had planted the roses, and the missing glove had been buried beneath them, then someone had deliberately hidden it. The glove had never been lost. It had been concealed. Julian closed his hand around the glove. This changes everything. That evening, after the children were asleep, Julian, Elowen, and Mrs. Pruitt gathered in the library. The glove rested on the table between them. It proves someone removed it from the scene, Elowen said. But why? Julian answered quietly. Because it carried evidence. What kind of evidence? He looked at the glove thoughtfully. I don't know. Pruitt suddenly leaned forward. My lord. Yes, turn it inside out. Julian carefully unfolded the cuff. Something small caught the candlelight, a tiny brass button. It wasn't attached to the glove. It had been trapped inside the folded wrist for years. Elowen picked it up. The button was engraved with a tiny crest, a lion standing beneath a crown. Julian's expression hardened instantly. I know that crest. You do. It belonged to a tailor in London. What does that mean? He made hunting coats. Pruitt looked confused, so Julian swallowed. He made only one hunting coat with this particular design. Elowen's heart began to race. Whom? Julian answered in a low voice. My brother. No one spoke. The tiny brass button suddenly seemed heavier than gold. If it came from Edmund's coat, Elowen whispered. Then he was close enough to Caroline for it to tear away. Julian nodded slowly, closer than he ever admitted. The first time in 5 years. There was physical evidence connecting Edmund to Caroline on the night she died. It still wasn't enough to prove murder, but it was enough to prove one thing: Edmund had lied, and if he had lied about being with Caroline, what else had he been hiding? Far away, in a London townhouse, Edmund Ashcombe sat alone in his study. A servant entered carrying the Evening Post. Among the letters was one with no return address. He opened it carelessly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only 6 words were written across it. They found the missing glove. The letter slipped from Edmund's hand for the first time in years. He looked afraid. The next morning, an urgent message arrived from London. It was from Mr. Whitmore, the family solicitor. He requested Julian's immediate presence and insisted that Elowen accompany him. The letter gave no explanation, only that the matter concerned Caroline's estate and could wait no longer. Julian folded the letter and looked at Elowen. I think the time for silence is over. By noon, they were seated in Mr. Whitmore's office. The elderly solicitor looked older than Elowen remembered. He placed a sealed envelope on his desk but made no move to open it. I received this yesterday, he said quietly. It was delivered by a gentleman who refused to give his name. Julian frowned. What is it? A confession. Room fell silent. Mr. Whitmore broke the seal and unfolded the pages. Writer claims he witnessed what happened on the night Lady Caroline died. Julian's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. Read it. Solicitor began. On the night of October 23rd, I was working in the East Wing repairing a broken window. As I was leaving, I heard Lord Edmund and Lady Caroline arguing on the staircase. Elowen held her breath. Lady Caroline told him she had discovered the missing estate funds and intended to tell the Earl the following morning. Mr. Whitmore continued reading. Lord Edmund begged her to remain silent. She refused. Julian closed his eyes. He reached for her arm to stop her. Lady Caroline pulled away. In the struggle, she lost her balance. Lord Edmund tried to catch her, but she slipped from his grasp and fell down the staircase. The room remained utterly still. It had not been a planned murder, but neither had it been an accident. It had been the result of Edmund's desperate attempt to silence her. Mr. Whitmore finished the final lines. Fear overcame me. I said nothing because Lord Edmund warned me that no one would believe a servant over a gentleman. I have lived with that cowardice every day since. The statement was signed, Thomas Briggs. Julian looked up in surprise. Carpenter. Mr. Whitmore nodded. He left England 4 years ago. Why speak now? He is dying. The solicitor's voice softened. He wished to clear his conscience before meeting his maker. Julian lowered his head into his hands. 5 years, 5 years of blaming himself, 5 years of wondering whether he could have saved Caroline, 5 years of protecting a brother who had never deserved it. A tear slipped down his cheek. I failed her. Elowen gently placed her hand over his. No, he looked at her. You didn't fail Caroline. She squeezed his hand. Man who chose greed over his own family failed her. For a long moment, Julian simply sat in silence, then he straightened. "What happens now, Mr. Whitmore answered quietly. "Magistrate has already been informed. Edmund, he was arrested this morning while attempting to board a ship bound for France." Julian closed his eyes once more, not in grief this time, in relief. The truth had finally caught up with the man who had spent 5 years running from it. That evening, Julian and Elowen returned to Ashcombe Hall. The house felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves had been waiting to hear the truth spoken aloud. Mrs. Pruitt met them in the entrance hall. She looked into Julian's eyes and knew. "It's over, isn't it?" Julian nodded. "Yes." The old housekeeper covered her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. "For 5 years," she whispered. "I prayed Lady Caroline would receive justice." Julian looked toward the second-floor corridor. Tomorrow, the locked study would finally be opened, not as a room of sorrow, but as a room of remembrance. And for the first time since the candle went out on that autumn night, Ashcombe Hall was finally ready to let the light back in. 3 days later, the magistrate's findings became official. After reviewing Thomas Briggs' sworn confession, the estate ledgers, the recovered glove, and the evidence presented by Mr. Whitmore, the authorities ruled that Caroline Ashcombe's death had not been the simple accident everyone had believed for 5 long years. Edmund Ashcombe admitted to confronting Caroline over the missing estate funds. He insisted he had never intended to kill her, claiming he had only grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving. But in that desperate struggle, Caroline lost her footing on the staircase and fell. His greed had begun the argument, his fear had caused the struggle, and his silence had stolen 5 years of peace from an entire family. He was sentenced according to the law, and with that, the long shadow hanging over Ashcombe Hall finally began to lift. When Julian returned home, he walked straight to Caroline's study. For several minutes, he stood in the doorway without entering. Then, quietly, he stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust that danced in the air. He looked at the writing desk where Caroline had penned her unfinished letter. He touched the chair she had once sat in. Finally, he whispered the words he had been unable to say for 5 years. "I'm sorry." His voice broke. "I should have protected you." Tears rolled freely down his face. "I thought locking this room would keep my memories safe." He looked around the room one last time, but all it did was lock away the life we shared. Behind him, Elowen remained silent. She understood that this was not a moment to interrupt. Some grief could only be spoken to the people who were no longer there to hear it. When Julian finally turned toward her, his eyes were red but peaceful. "It's time." She nodded. Together, they opened every curtain. Mrs. Pruitt arrived with 2 maids carrying fresh flowers. The windows were opened. The stale air drifted away. The dust was carefully cleaned. Books returned to their shelves. The embroidery Caroline had left unfinished was placed gently inside a glass frame. Nothing was erased. Nothing was hidden. Her memory would remain, but it would no longer be imprisoned. A week later, Julian gathered Margaret and Henry in the study. The children looked around the room with quiet curiosity. "This," Julian said softly, "was your mother's favorite room." Henry wandered toward the bookshelves. "So this is where she read stories?" Julian smiled through tears. "Yes." Margaret stepped closer to her father's side. "Why was it locked for so long?" Julian knelt beside her. "Because Daddy was hurting." Margaret wrapped her arms around his neck. "Miss her too." Julian held both of his children close. "So do I." For the first time since Caroline's death, the 3 of them cried together, not separately, not in silence, but as a family. Watching from the doorway, Elowen quietly wiped away her own tears. Mrs. Pruitt stood beside her. "Waited 5 years to see this." "So have they," Elowen replied. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the hills, Julian and Elowen walked through the rose garden, the same garden where Henry had discovered the missing glove. Julian stopped beside Caroline's favorite roses. "I used to think loving someone meant never letting them go." He looked toward the house. "But now I understand." "What do you understand?" He smiled gently. "That honoring the past doesn't mean living in it." Elowen slipped her hand into his. "And Caroline," Julian looked up at the evening sky. "Always love her." A gentle breeze stirred the roses. "But I think," he smiled through quiet tears, "she would want us to be happy." Elowen squeezed his hand. "I believe she already knew you would be." Behind them, the windows of Ashcombe Hall glowed warmly in the fading light for the first time in many years. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt like home. Ashcombe Hall seemed to awaken from years of sorrow. The gardens, once silent beneath frost, were filled with daffodils and roses. The laughter of Margaret and Henry echoed through the halls, and the servants smiled more often than they had in years. Mrs. Pruitt would sometimes pause in the corridor, listening to the sounds of a house that finally felt alive again. Yet one question remained unspoken. What place did Elowen now have at Ashcombe Hall? The mystery had been solved. Caroline had received justice. There was no longer any reason for a governess to remain once the children were old enough to continue with a tutor from the village. Elowen knew that. So did Julian. Neither had the courage to speak of it. One afternoon, Elowen sat beneath the great oak tree, reading while Henry chased butterflies across the lawn. Margaret sketched flowers nearby, humming softly to herself. Julian watched them from the library window. Mrs. Pruitt entered quietly. "Been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, my lord." Julian smiled without taking his eyes from the garden. "Have I? I believe you've forgotten the letters on your desk." "I believe you're right." She folded her hands. "Then why haven't you moved?" Julian laughed softly. "Because every time I tell myself to return to my work." His eyes found Elowen again. "I find another reason to stay." Pruitt smiled knowingly. "Caroline always said grief has a way of convincing us we'll never love again." Julian turned toward her. "I thought she was wrong." Now he looked back toward the garden. "Now I think she understood me better than I understood myself." That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Julian found Elowen arranging fresh flowers in the drawing room. "Beautiful," he said. She smiled. Henry insisted on picking everyone himself. "I suspected as much." For a while they worked in comfortable silence. Finally, Julian spoke. "When you first arrived," Elowen looked up. "Believed your presence would only remind me of everything I had lost. Did it?" At first, he took a slow breath, but then something changed. She waited quietly. "You reminded me that life hadn't ended." His voice was calm but filled with emotion. "You brought laughter back into this house." He smiled. "You gave my children back their childhood." His eyes met hers, and without realizing it, "You gave me back myself." Elowen felt tears gather in her eyes. "I never came here expecting any of this." "I know." "I only wanted a place to begin again." Julian nodded. "So did I." The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was gentle, comfortable, hopeful. At last, Julian reached into his pocket. He withdrew the small silver locket Elowen had accidentally left in the study days earlier. "Believe this belongs to you." She accepted it with a grateful smile. As their hands touched, neither of them pulled away for just a moment. The world seemed to stand still. Then, softly, Julian spoke. "Elowen." She looked into his eyes. "I don't wish to rush your heart. I would never ask you to forget Caroline." "I couldn't." He smiled sadly. "Nor would I want to." He stepped a little closer. "But I have discovered something." "What is it?" "Love doesn't replace love." A tear slipped down Elowen's cheek. "It simply makes room for another." She could no longer hide her feelings. "Been afraid?" "So have I. I'm only a governess." "You're far more than that. You deserve someone of your own station." Julian shook his head. "I deserve someone who is kind." He smiled warmly. "Someone my children already love." At that very moment, a small voice interrupted them. "I knew it." They both turned. Margaret stood in the doorway with Henry beside her. Henry grinned from ear to ear. "I told Margaret father smiles differently when Miss Hartley is here." Margaret folded her arms, pretending to be serious. "So," she asked, "you going to marry her?" Julian and Elowen stared at each other before bursting into laughter. For the first time in many years, the laughter filling Ashcombe Hall wasn't hiding pain. It was the sound of a family finding joy again. Margaret's question hung in the air. "So, are you going to marry her?" Henry looked eagerly from his father to Elowen, waiting for an answer. Julian couldn't help but laugh. "My dear, you've asked a rather important question." Margaret smiled innocently. "Only asked because everyone already knows." Elowen blinked in surprise, nodded enthusiastically. "Cook knows. The gardener knows," Margaret added. "And Mrs. Pruitt definitely knows." As if on cue, Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the hallway carrying a basket of freshly folded linens. She looked from the embarrassed couple to the smiling children and raised an eyebrow. "I believe I've arrived at a rather interesting moment." Julian chuckled. "It would seem so." Pruitt smiled warmly. "What it's worth, my lord." She looked at Elowen. Lady Caroline always believed that happiness should never be delayed by fear. Her words settled gently over the room. Julian turned to the children. "Would you two mind giving Miss Hartley and me a few moments alone?" Henry grinned. "That mean you're going to ask?" Margaret took her brother's hand. "Come along, we already know the answer." Children disappeared down the corridor, giggling as they went. Their laughter echoed through the house. Julian waited until they were out of sight before turning back to Elowen. "I never imagined I would be given a second chance." "Neither did I." she admitted softly. When Caroline died, I believed my heart had died with her. He looked toward the portrait hanging above the fireplace. I will always honor her memory. Elowen nodded. And you should. He stepped closer. But Caroline taught me something even after she was gone. What was that? That love isn't measured by how long we mourn. His voice was gentle. It's measured by how bravely we choose to live afterward. Elowen felt tears welling in her eyes. I was afraid loving you would somehow dishonor her. Julian slowly shook his head. No, he smiled. I think she would be disappointed if we spent the rest of our lives refusing the happiness she wanted for others. Elowen remembered the unfinished letter. A woman trying to right an old wrong. A woman who had quietly arranged for a stranger's future. A woman whose final act had brought them together. She smiled through her tears. I think you're right. Julian reached into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box. Elowen's breath caught. He opened it. Inside rested a simple gold ring set with a single sapphire. It belonged to my grandmother, he said quietly. I had it resized. He looked directly into her eyes. Miss Elowen Hartley. His voice trembled slightly. You walked into this house believing you were beginning a new chapter. You helped my children smile again. You gave truth to a family buried beneath silence. Somewhere along the way, he smiled. You became the home my heart had been searching for. He took a slow breath. You do me the greatest honor of becoming my wife. For a moment, Elowen could not speak. Every hardship that had brought her to Ashcombe Hall, the broken engagement in Bath, the lonely carriage ride, the whispered warnings, the locked study, the unanswered questions. Every step had led to this moment. Finally, she whispered the only word her heart could find. Yes. Julian slipped the ring onto her finger. Before either of them noticed, applause echoed from the doorway. Margaret, Henry, Mrs. Prewitt, the cook. 2 footmen, even the gardener had quietly wandered inside. Henry threw his arms around both of them. I knew she'd say. Prewitt wiped away happy tears. Served this family for 25 years. She smiled warmly. I don't believe I've ever witnessed a happier day. Julian looked around at the people who had stood beside his family through grief, silence, and finally healing. Ashcombe Hall no longer felt like a place trapped by the past. It had become a home filled with hope. As the church bells from the nearby village rang in the distance, Elowen looked toward Caroline's portrait. For just a moment, the late afternoon sunlight rested gently upon it. Elowen smiled, not because she believed it was a sign, but because, in her heart, she knew that Caroline's final act of kindness had changed all of their lives. Sometimes, the greatest legacy a person leaves behind is not the sorrow their absence creates, but the love that continues to grow because they once lived.